The leaks of the participants in the seventh round of nuclear negotiations, which started last Monday in the Austrian capital Vienna, do not suggest, up to now, the possibility of achieving rapid breakthroughs that would restore the main concerned American and Iranian parties to their commitments in the 2015 nuclear agreement. The European negotiators talked about an unopened timeout, but they later eased the pressure on the deadlines, referring to an open round reasonably, until all differences are resolved. However, several factors stand in the way of optimism about the possibility of such a breakthrough. On the one hand, there is the progress made in the Iranian nuclear program itself, since Tehran violated its commitments in the agreement, and on the other hand, the U.S. conditions, some of which are due to constitutional obstacles that the administration of U.S. President Joe Biden cannot overcome. There is almost unanimity that returning to the nuclear negotiating table in its current seventh round would not have taken place had Washington not made a significant concession. This, although it was not part of her bag, and she believes in its limits in the end, and is represented in her acceptance of excluding research into Iran's ballistic missile program and Tehran's destabilizing policies in the region. Some talk about an American acceptance of some regional role for Iran, in exchange for the latter's abandonment of its great ambitions in the region, while regional and international parties cooperate, albeit indirectly with Washington, to manicure Iran, in light of the successive blows it receives, whether from Israel or from the political and popular movement in the countries of the Shiite Crescent, and the setbacks of its war in Yemen. Then there is also the position of China and Russia, for despite their dual role in using Iran in their conflict with Washington, they will not accept the presence of a new nuclear player on their borders. It was remarkable, for example, that on Wednesday, a group of Democratic and Republican representatives introduced a bill calling for the imposition of sanctions on the Iranian drone program and its suppliers, as the largest source of terrorism in the world. However, Parliament's passage of the bill, as expected, sends a clear signal on the one hand about the limits of Iran's acceptable role, and about the tools that Washington possesses to compel its leaders to modestly in their ambitions, and on the other hand, reassure the countries of the region. Hardening Tehran. On the other hand, Iran is showing a tough stance, by sticking to lifting the sanctions that paralyzed its economy, and obtaining guarantees that no future U.S. administration will cancel the new agreement, and that negotiating drafts are subject to negotiation, and unless everything is agreed upon, nothing will be agreed upon. Nothing, according to its chief negotiator, Ali Bagheri Khani. However, observers believe that this strictness is directed to the Iranian interior only. The reason is that achieving these two conditions is rejected by Washington, and even Iran is aware of that. The sanctions will not be lifted until Tehran vows to reverse its steps to increase the level of uranium enrichment, which it is continuing in its nuclear facilities, one by one. This is what Washington considers a reward for the defiant policies practiced by the Iranian leadership, and fears that it will turn a model for other parties, and practice similar policies, to obtain concessions from them in their dispute files with it. Iran has returned to negotiations, abandoning the preconditions of its new president, Ibrahim Raisi, and accepting the outcomes of the previous 6 rounds as a basis on which to build, as confirmed by the European coordinator in the negotiations, Enrique Mora, and this is in light of Israel's warnings of the possibility of taking individual action in the event that it takes place. Sanctions relief without guarantees on Iran's nuclear program. Israel will not stand still. Meanwhile, prominent Republican U.S. Senator Jim Risch had warned that Israel will not stand still if Iran comes close to acquiring a nuclear weapon. And he added, "I am not afraid of Israel attacking Iran, but I am confident that it will." Risch added that he spoke with the administration of President Biden, and advised the White House to be ready, when it receives the call, to inform the administration that Israel struck Iran. Then he went on, "I asked them what you would do when you received the call. Will you stand behind Israel as a spectator? Or will you support her in battle?" Hence, the Republican senator emphasized that the bipartisan Congress was committed to supporting Israel. Accordingly, some in Washington believe that Israel has conveyed a clear message, and its officials' tours of France and Britain, before the start of negotiations and during them, are part of the policy of drawing lines accepted by it for the Iranian regional role with which it can coexist with the condition that its nuclear teeth are removed. Needless to say, the Biden administration announced, since the first day of receiving the keys to the White House, that returning to the nuclear agreement with Iran is part of its efforts to cancel the policies of the administration of former President Donald Trump, and to renew former President Barack Obama's experience in a positive economic partnership with it. Perhaps it will turn into an element of stability in the region. However, this administration realizes, on the other hand, that the road in Washington is not paved, given the objections of Republicans and some Democrats alike, and their differences with President Biden. Biden himself realizes that investing any achievement in this field cannot be employed internally, with the Democrats' setbacks less than a year before the midterm elections, and the significant decline in American support for him in opinion polls. The Biden administration has been keen to present a message of reassurance to the Americans that it will not squander its main goal of preventing Iran from acquiring a nuclear weapon, constraining its program, and addressing its destabilizing behavior, White House spokeswoman Jen Psaki said. Although the U.S. State Department described the recent nuclear breakthroughs, especially the talk that Tehran is close to enriching uranium to 90% purity. As rumors, the ministry said that this would be a provocative act. And it warned that Iran's continued nuclear escalation is unconstructive, as well as its conflict with the goal of returning to compliance with the nuclear agreement, and does not provide it with any negotiating influence. Galina Porter, Deputy Foreign Ministry spokesman, also warned that if Iran asks for more than just a mutual return to the agreement, or offers less than that, the negotiations will not succeed. This prompted U.S. officials to stress that their expectations are very low from the current round of negotiations, that the Iranians are not yet ready to negotiate seriously, and that other options are still on the table. Republican objections threaten any agreement. In a related context, the Republicans raised their tone, and threatened the Biden administration and Iran together, that the chances of passing any new agreement that does not meet their conditions, and that advances at least the term of the first agreement that is nearing its expiry, will not pass in the Senate and House of Representatives. They said that they will return to him, as soon as they assume the reins of power, whether after the 2022 midterm elections, or after the presidential elections in 2024 in particular, which they trust will return them to the White House. Although no new Democratic positions will be issued, with the exception of the position of Democratic Senator Bob Menendez, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who opposes, with some Democrats, this opposition is significant. It reminds Biden of a delicate balance in Congress. Democrats have almost equal seats with Republicans, not to mention a fragile majority in the House of Representatives, where loyalty to the ballot box and the mood of the voters. Here, the Republicans poured out their anger on Biden, warning that he had replaced the policy of maximum pressure on Iran with a policy of maximum concessions. Republican Senator Bill Hagerty called on the Senate to vote on a bill he introduced to oblige the U.S. administration to obtain congressional approval before any lifting of sanctions. Hagerty said he was able to garner support for his project, bringing the number of supporters to 34 senators. That's enough to block any presentation of the nuclear deal as a treaty in the Senate, because the treaties require a 2/3 majority of the 100 votes to be formally approved. It is infuriating that Robert Malley, Biden's negotiator, wants to bid on the nuclear deal and bribe the Iranian regime with a complete lifting of sanctions, Hagerty added. By the way, the Republicans hold Malley, and current Biden's national security advisor, Jake Sullivan, responsible for engineering the course of negotiations with Iran and the results that have resulted from them, since the administration of former President Barack Obama. They believe that Malley's leftist backgrounds and negative attitudes toward countries in the region, including Israel, made him treat Iran as a country ruled by a national liberation regime. Republican Senator Marco Rubio warned against any lifting of sanctions on Tehran before the Iranian regime abandons its goal of developing nuclear weapons to threaten the region and Israel. The maximum pressure campaign was a success, Rubio tweeted. In the House of Representatives, 20 Republican lawmakers sent a letter to the White House to tell President Biden that they are ready to block any effort to help Iran return billions of dollars in funds frozen under the Trump administration's lobbying campaign. The letter accused the Biden administration of avoiding congressional picture of what is going on about the sanctions and leaving lawmakers in the dark regarding its plans to weaken the enforcement of sanctions and ease them on Iran, as they put it. China is a major player. Lifting sanctions, however, is not the only concern expressed by Republicans in Washington. They accuse the Biden administration of ignoring the implementation of existing sanctions, which have not yet been lifted, and that the Treasury and State Departments are ignoring the imposition of sanctions on Iran and China, despite their illegal trade in oil. The Republicans wrote, although many of the sanctions that President Trump has imposed technically remain in place, your administration has deliberately refrained from imposing these sanctions on Iran and its proxies. In particular, China continues to illegally import oil from Iran, without any sanctions on the two countries. Republican Representative Pat Fallon tweeted, "We must not reward Iran for its recent aggressions by resuming nuclear talks. I am therefore proud to write this letter with 20 of my colleagues to highlight our concern about renewed negotiations. Biden's extreme concessions have made Iran even more hostile," said Republican Representative Jim Banks, one of the letter's signatories. And when the Republicans regain control of the majority in Congress, we will make sure that any waiver of sanctions on Iran by the Biden administration is temporary. Republicans point out that since the start of negotiations with the Iranian regime, its support for terrorism has increased, and its uranium enrichment has reached its highest levels. The letter stated, despite the weakness in imposing sanctions and lifting sanctions on a number of Iranian groups and their proxies, such as the Houthis in Yemen and the Assad regime in Syria, the Iranian regime has not modified its behavior, but rather its proxies have become more hostile. However, there are those who say that the negotiations will not only yield any progress, but that the policies pursued by all successive U.S. administrations were not enough to force Iran to change its behavior and calculations. A report by the Republican Foundation for Defense of Democracy says that no matter how much money Washington unleashes or the maximum pressure imposed on it, Iran will continue to humiliate Americans, as long as the United States and Israel have repeatedly ruled out not disrupting the program. Iranian nuclear power. This undermined the regime's fear of being attacked, and allowed the supreme leader, Ali Khomeini, to maneuver further. The report adds, all U.S. administrations have sincerely, sometimes desperately, wanted a deal, but Tehran, which pretends to be interested in diplomacy, knows that Washington, fearing another war in the Middle East, will make more concessions. Some stress that directing the United States' political, economic, and military resources to compete with China, may make the latter a decisive party in the ongoing bargaining with it, to control Iran's behavior, in return for obtaining prices in other files from Washington. China is today the largest buyer of Iranian oil, after its sales rose to about 1.2 million barrels, from 200,000 barrels last year. With the Biden administration, undoubtedly, choosing to overlook this rise, hoping that China would play a role in persuading Iran to return to the nuclear deal, Beijing has turned into Tehran's primary financial artery, which gives it the ability to pressure it, should it decide to do so. But betting on this trade-off may not necessarily suggest that competition with China may take positive paths, in light of the Biden administration's adherence to Trump's policies towards it. Iran and the game of time to own the nuclear bomb. Since the United States withdrew from the nuclear agreement under former President Donald Trump in May 2018 and imposed comprehensive sanctions on Tehran, Iran has gradually expanded the scope of its nuclear activities, and has taken a series of major technical steps, during this year alone, to enable it to use it in a nuclear weapons program, despite its claim that its nuclear program is for peaceful and civilian purposes only. Iran has now accumulated a stockpile of enriched uranium more than 11 times the limits set in the 2015 nuclear deal. As of November 6, it had produced 17.7 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium, according to the United Nations Atomic Energy Agency. In 6 rounds of negotiations between April and June under the previous Iranian government, discussions on how to return the United States and Iran to compliance with the agreement made significant progress, according to European and UN officials. They spoke of the two sides drafting a text covering about 70% of the points of contention, although there are differences over key issues, such as the extent of U.S. sanctions relief and the amount of Iran's most advanced centrifuges that will be allowed to operate. For their part, the Europeans, the Russians, and the Chinese are aware of the difficulty of lifting all U.S. sanctions, especially those related to terrorism, which can only be removed by the Congress that has approved them. If the Iranians are betting on cutting time, in order to achieve an irreversible breakthrough in obtaining a nuclear bomb, the questions about the reasons for not reaching an agreement become legitimate. In particular, about Iran's seriousness to abandon its nuclear ambitions in the first place, in order to secure the achievement of two main goals, protecting the regime and its permanence, and protecting its expansionist policies and interventions.